Right. It's noon, so I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I see attendees on the sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our Constitution Day discussion with Senator Russ Feingold. My name is Angela Stroud. I'm an associate professor of sociology and social justice at Northland College, and I'm going to moderate this discussion today. We're going to run till about 12:50. Senator Feingold and I will chat for the first 20-30 minutes or so, and then we'll entertain any questions you might have. You're welcome to post those in the chat, and I will read them for you. So I'm honored to introduce our guest for today, Senator Russ Feingold, who represented Wisconsin in the United States Senate from 1993 to 2011, was a Wisconsin State Senator from 83 to 93. He's originally from Janesville, Wisconsin, attended the University of Wisconsin, was a Rhodes Scholar, and received his law degree from Harvard. While in the Senate, Mr. Feingold was known for standing up for progressive principles, including his opposition to the Iraq War, being a fierce advocate for keeping corporate money out of politics, and protecting the rights of marginalized people. He was the only US Senator to vote against the Patriot Act, which gave the US government powers to surveil citizens in direct violation of our constitutionally protected legal rights. Parts of that act were eventually determined to be unconstitutional, which vindicated Senator Feingold's brave stand against the law at a time when few people were willing to stand up to government overreach. Since March of 2020, which is a very auspicious time to begin a new job, he's been the president of the American Constitution Society, an organization that was founded in 2001. The ACS defines its values as rooted in beliefs that the Constitution is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And they work to uphold the Constitution in the 21st century by ensuring that law is a force for protecting our democracy and the public interest, and for improving people's lives. Senator Feingold, welcome to this virtual session with Northland College. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you, Professor. It is a delight to be here. Anybody that knows me knows my favorite place on earth is basically you're part of the country, you're part of the state. I go up 34, 35 years in a row on Madeline Island for part of every summer. I know Ashland well, I know this campus quite well. And I'll tell you that when I was running for re-election in 1998, we wanted to do some really unusual sort of scenarios. We went to a Renaissance fair and I got in a, medieval knight's outfit. But one of the things we did was in a big, heavy snowstorm, a bunch of Northland students went with me out to Ulu Rock. And you can probably look it up on YouTube. And we did this great scene with them running around, helping me in my campaign by filming that. And we put it in our first ad. So deeply grateful to the college for its emphasis on what it does. And also want to mention the loss of one of your great benefactors, Mary Rice, who did so much for the whole area. And very sad that I won't be able to see her when I come back, but she loved Northland College. So thank you so much for inviting me on Constitution Day.
Right. Well, I'd like to start by getting straight to the lead. What do you see as among the key issues that the founders got wrong? And where do we see evidence of their mistakes in contemporary political issues?
Well, we were all brought up to revere the Constitution, and I don't think that's a bad thing to be taught to revere the basic document. And there are people that like to think that the document was divinely inspired, it was provided by Providence. Of course, it was inspired in part by the brilliant philosophers of the Enlightenment, people like John Locke and Montesquieu. So it ended up being essentially the first written constitution ever. We were always kind of taught to believe that it was somehow perfect. Well, of course, that's not true. Truth is that this was a number of well-to-do white men who certainly did not have a lot of people at the table or in the room in 1787, during that hot summer in 1787. No women, of course, no African Americans, no Native Americans, and others. And the document reflects that. The document in some ways isn't pretty at all. In some ways it's a marvelous concept. In some ways it's a brutal exclusion. preserving slavery, not prohibiting slavery and preserving it actually in some ways. Creating a system that was so biased toward making sure the states wouldn't lose their role that it is really what we say now is malapportioned, that a very few people or a very few number of states can really prevent the majority from getting their will. And one of the embarrassing moments for the right in this country was when they had that big Tea Party election in 2010, and they said, we're the ones who support the Constitution. You know, they were waving this thing around like it was theirs. And they decided, we'll start off the first meeting by reading out the whole Constitution. So they read the whole thing out. Apparently they didn't realize is when you read this thing, it still refers to 3/5 man. That slaves were considered only 3/5 human for purposes of counting. And so there are embarrassments right there. For this is the reason why this group, the American Constitution Society, which frankly was a response 20 years ago to the rights trying to take over our courts and our legal system, that our 20th anniversary is devoted to the issue of race in the Constitution. We call it our founding failures. To be candid about what this document lacked or what it had put into place that was reflected then, ever since in brutal treatment of African Americans, whether it be voting or healthcare or the ability to own a home, as well as the brutal treatment of Native Americans. Today, later in the day, we're going to have one of our programs on specifically the issue of Native Americans. So we believe that the only way to allow the Constitution to be credible and to allow it to be understood going forward and to correct its mistakes is to be candid about this and realize that the Constitution has to be adapted to the country that we live in now, the diverse, marvelous combination of people that live here now. It can't just be a document that was ratified in 1789 and work. And so there are many other issues, but those are some of the ones that I would highlight.
Thinking about that history, I'm currently teaching a class called Undoing Racism, and we think about the history of the Founding Fathers a little bit in that class. And there's a misconception, I think, sometimes that they were just reflecting the sentiments of their day and they didn't know better. But if you actually engage with the debates around the founding of the Constitution, there was a lot of debates about whether slavery was moral and how can we have a Constitution founded on freedom and liberty and justice while having an institution of slavery. Knowing that history, knowing that they actually were debating that and questioning whether or not that was acceptable for the time has changed the way I think about the Constitution in terms of what it was trying to do. What is your reading of the history of how the debates happened? How does that shape the way you think about it?
Well, it's a very important way to understand what happened as people talk about the Connecticut Compromise and the brilliant things that were done. The real dynamic was that these folks came together in Philadelphia. It was actually an illegal convention. It was the Articles of Confederation were the law of the land. And they just realized the thing wasn't going to work. So they said, let's go to Philadelphia. They were down in Annapolis, says, let's meet up in Philadelphia. So in theory, they go up there in order to create some changes to the Articles of Confederation. They didn't. They said, we're just going to do a whole new thing. And instead of having all the states have to ratify it, it just has to be 3/4. And so that was their goal. And so they started debating. And yes, their goal was a union rather than just a confederation. But in order to get that, those slave states had to be mollified. They needed to be guaranteed that slavery wouldn't be prohibited, at least at that time. There was already a lot of ferment in the world, in England and other places, about banning slavery and slave trade. But we had a lot of slaveholders in that room. George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson was over in France as an ambassador at that point, but he was a big slave owner. So what you had was both the reality that many of the delegates wanted to keep slavery, and the other delegates somehow realized that if they didn't create some kind of a mechanism to do that, they would never get it ratified. So these compromises, even though people often talk about the genius of having the House being popularly elected, and in those days the Senate was elected by the legislature, it was not a popular vote until the 17th Amendment. What that really was a guarantee that the slave states would have enough senators to make sure that it would be very hard to ban slavery. And the same thing goes for Article 5 of the Constitution, which I do a lot of my sort of work on in my own time. Article 5 is the provision that makes it so you can amend the Constitution. You can basically amend anything except for one thing, just one thing. You can get rid of the president, you can get rid of the Supreme Court. The one thing is that all the states have to have the same number of senators. So that locks in the way in which Vermont, like less than 1 million people, has fewer than 1 million people, has the same number of senators as the state of California. And even worse, if you want to change that, if you want to change those rules, but let's say that wasn't there, but you want to change something else in the Constitution. It requires 3/4 of the states to agree to any amendment. And that's the most difficult mechanism in the world for amending the Constitution. As a result, other than the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments, we've only had 17 amendments in the entire history of this country. And again, a lot of the motivation was making sure that the slave states wouldn't have a group of majority or even a supermajority, not 3/4, but like a substantial number of states say, well, let's get rid of slavery now. And of course, this had a lot to do with ultimately the Civil War, 50, 60 years later.
Yeah, and it brings us to this point now, as you said, Vermont having fewer than 1 million, Wyoming having something around 700,000, 600,000, something like that, people having the same political representation as California, as Texas, New York, as these large states. I mean, how have we seen that in recent years in terms of more contemporary issues, kind of undermining the principles of democracy?
Well, I think people really are becoming more and more acutely aware of the danger of this. And of course, it's even worse. So that it's not just that every state gets 2 senators. The filibuster requires that you have to get 60% of those already malapportioned senators. So it's like layer upon layer upon layer of enfranchising a minority in a way that disenfranchises minorities around the country, minority groups. And a new senator from Georgia said it that way. Senator Warnock, Reverend Warnock, said the idea that you would have a filibuster against a voting rights bill to protect the rights of the minority in the Senate to the exclusion of the rights of the people of the country who might be minorities is an absurdity. And so it's gotten out of hand. And look, I want to be candid about this because, I've studied this and I've taught it at a lot of universities. The idea of unlimited debate in the Senate is not in itself a bad thing. There was no real problem with filibusters throughout the 19th century. It didn't really become a significant enough concern until the early years before World War I. And Woodrow Wilson wanted to take us into World War I. And a lot of progressives and so-called isolationists, people like Fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, they opposed it and they mounted a filibuster. And that filibuster so enraged Woodrow Wilson that he convinced the Senate to at least put some limit. So this is where cloture came from. This is the way if you get 60 votes, or at that time it was 2/3, you could cut it off. So, people might have thought that was okay. But what happened is, historically is, then the filibuster got a very bad name. It had a terrible name when I was growing up, which is it was the tool used by the racist senators from the South to prevent passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts for many years. And it was the courage of Lyndon Johnson, who had had some real problems in terms of being a segregationist and other things early in his career, who finally realized he had to corral some of these people and break the filibuster, and they passed it. So the filibuster has long been associated with that. Now, look, Professor, when I was there, it wasn't always used for bad stuff. When Senator Reed in Nevada did not want a nuclear repository put in his state in Yucca Mountain, he got up and talked a lot. I did it for the Wisconsin dairy industry one night. We had a pricing system that was beneficial to us since the 1930s, because we're America's dairy land. And these 2 senators from Vermont, terrible people, Pat Leahy and Bernie Sanders, they were fighting for their state. They managed to put a provision in a housing bill that was going to screw us in terms of reimbursement. And so I said to my staff, get me some recipe books and some history. And so I came out to the floor and I had recipe books, the history of cheese. Mr. President, Camembert is the king of cheese. And cheese goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. And then I read a couple of recipes. And so this went on for a few hours. And the chairwoman, Barbara Mikulski, was about the toughest person in the Senate, kind of snapped at me. She said, how long is the senator going to talk? And I said, until this darn provision is taken out of here. Oh, she took it out. So, this was not some awful thing. However, now it is being used, not only systematically without ever having to talk, but to destroy the voting rights of Americans. And this is unforgivable. In my view, at a bare minimum, the filibuster should not apply to voting rights legislation. It should just be a majority vote. And that's one of the things that the president, Biden, has now said, according to reports this week, that he's going to start directly lobbying senators to say, you cannot use a filibuster here. But what you could see here is these traditions that were sort of done in the name of debate and free exchange of ideas. And, you can see this sort of idealistic idea of people, instead of being partisan, they're just going to talk to each other and listen to each other. That's not the reality of the filibuster today. It's kind of a farce. And in fact, it's very harmful. And so it needs to be changed or reformed in some way.
It seems to me no better issue for doing that than protecting the vote.
I think that's right. I mean, it's foundational. One of the interesting things is that you and I may think there is a right to vote in the Constitution. There's not, which I think should be changed. I think there should be a constitutional right to vote. It's left up to the states. And look what they're doing with it. The right is funding every possible way through gerrymandering, through ID cards, through limiting early voting, not letting people vote on Sundays, whatever they can come up with, making it hard for people to, consolidating voting machines in some place that's 4 miles away from the heart of the central city, whatever it might be. But frankly, this is one of the most vicious things I've ever seen done in this country. There was none of this in terms of politics when I was growing up, in most of the time I was in politics. In fact, not even until I was defeated in 2010, we had never seen a systematic attempt in the North anyway to undermine people's right to vote. And now it's in full flower and it has to be stopped.
I think that point about it being in the North, I mean, it's really reminiscent of Jim Crow era tactics, but instead of race being the marker explicitly, it's political party. And so you see,
which is phony, which is false. And in Wisconsin, the case came out of Wisconsin that went to the Supreme Court, where we thought finally they're going to admit that when it's done for political reasons, it's often really masking race. A good example is, two major cities in Wisconsin that have always been seen as distinct are Kenosha and Racine. Well, they figured out a way to jam the two together. And the goal, of course, was to minimize the impact of the African-American populations and Latino and Latinx populations in those two communities. So I thought it was a devastating blow, and that case did not prevail. Originally, reapportionment was insisted upon, and one person, one vote for state legislatures in cases, Reynolds versus Sims and other cases in the early 60s. That was a landmark, but it has not been applied to the political situation, as you said. So this is a very important and extremely serious matter. We saw in 2018 in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, all the statewide officers became Democrats. Democrats prevailed overwhelmingly. In fact, 53% of the votes cast for the state assembly were for Democrats. And yet the Democrats lost ground in both the state Senate and the state assembly. And that is because of an illegitimate, gerrymandered system that really, I don't think, can be justified in the 21st century under our Constitution. But so far, the court doesn't see it that way.
So the last 4 years have been marked by, it seems, constitutional crisis after constitutional crisis that there hasn't been clear resolution or clear how do we navigate in these moments. So from, as soon as Trump became president, he was violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution, threats to the First Amendment, which were rampant over the last 4 years, banning people from quote unquote Muslim countries. recruiting foreign governments to interfere in domestic elections, the politicization of the Supreme Court. And then currently most disturbing is these voter suppression tactics being deployed in states throughout the country. Is our political system structured to face these challenges?
It's not clear that it is anymore, because I don't think anybody anticipated the ruthlessness of the right, that they would break norms and traditions that were still in place when I was in the Senate. You know, there was a general attitude is, you know, Supreme Court appointments, you kind of debated, and yeah, if there's something really wrong with the person, you don't approve it, but the person was basically qualified, you approved it. That's not the system at all now. It's all blood and guts and partisanship. And this is becoming a structural problem. Now that the right has a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court, you say that even though they did some things to peel back some of the Trump stuff, even though of course, they scoffed at Trump's claims that he had actually won the election, that's good. But basically what they're doing is dismantling the right to vote and dismantling a woman's right to choose. And these people are going to be there on that court for decades. And they did it by stealing. They stole the court. Well, those are not words I would have used, Angela, ever when I was in the United States Senate. You just have to identify exactly the moment that we're in. We are in a crisis. And this crisis is that these folks are going to continue to dismantle things that many of us fought all our lives for, not by passing legislation, but by the court following a hard right agenda. So what do you do about it? Well, we here at the American Constitution Society support judicial reform. What does that mean? Well, it can mean a number of things. One thing is it can mean adding more seats to the Supreme Court, one way or another, either by creating a new law that allows each president to appoint some people and that sort of thing. That can be done without a constitutional amendment. And there's a growing number of people that think that needs to be done because that could provide some immediate relief. And again, what is the theft? The theft was that when Justice Scalia died, President Obama, who had almost a year left in his term, had not only the right, but really the duty to fill that seat. He appointed a great person, Merrick Garland, who's now our Attorney General. And they wouldn't even give him a hearing. They wouldn't even let him be considered. That was completely illegitimate. To me, that was a violation of the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. So that was one seat. We can debate about the Kavanaugh seat where, you know, obviously the allegations against him were serious, but, you know, let's skip to the third one. Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies right before the election. And instead of using the normal procedure that everyone would expect, it would be done through the normal process, probably left to the next president. They jammed it through as fast as they could. So that's what they did. They stole at least 2 seats. What do you do when somebody steals from you? Well, you report it. You try to do something about it. You try to get back what was stolen from you. And so one way to do it is by expanding the court. Another way that would take longer, but I think more and more people on the right first proposed it, is term limits for members of the Supreme Court. I've never liked term limits in politics because there are elections where people can decide, but can't do that with the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of scholars, both on the right and left, and a lot of people who now think, how about an 18-year limit, at least for service on the Supreme Court? So I think that's a growing idea about structural change. So those are 2 things that are being more and more discussed. And I'll tell you, ever since the court effectively overturned Roe v. Wade a couple of weeks ago, silently, without even really debating it, the calls for fundamental change to the Supreme Court are reaching a fever pitch, and it needs to be done.
On the issue of a Supreme Court justice being stolen, which I think is the right way to talk about it, you know, for those of us who don't live in this world of debating constitutional law and talking about it with others, how widespread is that notion? And is it
stolen?
Yeah, that it was stolen, that there's something that needs to be done. Is this something that you could see real traction coming around? Or is it something, because you know, there was such chaos in that era that it feels in some respects like it was just one of the many sort of disturbing things that happened.
Under Trump, that's how it felt. And that was part of their strategies. They just constantly do a million different things so you don't even know what to get upset about. So you're right. This is tricky because people have not, particularly on the left, have not really focused on the courts, much to our detriment. It's not even just the Supreme Court. Most of the second level courts, the courts of appeals, which are very important, sometimes they're the final word, they've now become majority very conservative in almost every case. And so it did turn out, according to the pollsters, that when this rush to judgment was done after the death of Justice Ginsburg, that there was finally a recognition by progressives and people on the left and Democrats that something really wrong had been done and that it was really a crime. So it started, but I would say the average person still thinks, well, that's just politics. And it's not. It's not the way the court's been chosen. And the reason it can't be that way is, one thing if people say, well, one guy's running against another for the House of Representatives and he said that and she said that. Okay, politicians lie all the time. That's normal. This is the Supreme Court. These people basically get to decide the most fundamental final decisions in our democracy. And it is losing legitimacy. It's not being seen as a legitimate institution anymore because of these steps. And that is a message that we need to get out. People have to realize that their most basic protection, a legitimate Supreme Court, has been stolen from them. But no, it is not yet penetrated as much as it should. And that's one of the things I work on every day, is trying to get that message out.
We have a question in the chat that I'd love to hear your view on. Is a woman's right to choose this in terms of reproductive health? Is this the same kind of argument that can be made for people to not have to take the COVID vaccine without losing their job? What's the difference between a woman's right to choose in terms of abortion and a person's right to choose getting a vaccine in light of a global pandemic and federal mandates?
Well, of course, they're both in general terms issues of personal liberty. But there's a huge difference between those things that affect everybody else directly and those things that are your own personal decision. I think most of us who are fair-minded about this, and certainly the court in Roe v. Wade, believe that the issue of whether a woman wants to take a pregnancy to term is about her own private right, her own personhood. And it does not have a general impact endangering every other person in society. Well, traditionally, vaccination has been viewed differently. Way back to 1905, there was a Supreme Court decision that said, yes, states can mandate vaccinations in situations that endanger the public generally. And of course, one of the things that's amazing is to see places like Mississippi, the governor says the president's vaccination program is an abomination. It's an attack on liberty. Every kid in Mississippi has to get a mumps shot and vaccine. They got to get chicken pox. And they brag about the fact they've got the highest level of vaccination in the country, and it's mandatory. So how can it be that is not legitimate? It is phony. That's what I like to call fake law. The law does permit vaccinations, even mandating them. By the way, the president is not calling for mandating vaccinations. What he has said is, for certain groups like federal employees and others, you can either get vaccinated or do a weekly test. So it doesn't even require vaccination. But the point is that I think it's pretty easy to see the difference between a personal judgment about whether to take a pregnancy to term versus something that can endanger every other person you come in contact with and threaten the whole world. This has dominated the entire world. It's of a completely different scale.
Yeah, great. What kind of country could we be if we actually lived up to the principles in the Constitution?
Well, it could be a much more enjoyable place to live. I think many of us, on all sides of the political equation, see the stress, see the anger, see the fear. And it's not the kind of environment that I grew up in this country. I mean, I grew up in Janesville, Wisconsin, and it's all white town. Women, there wasn't even sports for girls in high school, and there were a lot of things that were totally wrong. Don't get me wrong. But the mood and the attitude was not angry and vicious and hateful. And that has changed dramatically. It's very hard to see the American people at each other's throats nonstop. almost in the worst way since the Civil War. And what's some ways different about it, at least that was sort of a division between two parts of the country. This is everywhere. I mean, I'm sitting here right now, and we can see people who are coming in to rally tomorrow in defense of the people at the January 6th insurrection. They're coming to town again. And this is unheard of, this kind of thing. I mean, I'll tell you, George Bush said it well the other day. Very courageous thing. He was at the memorial for 20 years since 9/11, the Flight 93 location. And he said, basically, what's the big difference between the people that attacked us on 9/11 and the people that assaulted the Capitol? He said, they're from the same ilk of hate and division. So how could it be different? If those kinds of views could be repudiated and people could be taught to care about each other and care about all Americans, everybody's lives would be a lot better. We'd be a lot happier. We'd do better as a country. But we are so far away from it right now. It's very hard for an older guy to look at that and go, is this thing even going to get better as long as I'm around? Thinking of my kids now, my grandchildren, hopeful.
I think when I look at January 6th and the way that's being spun by so many people, being minimized as not the significant attack on our democracy that it was, it just reminds me, because I'm so steeped right now in this history with my students of slavery and Reconstruction, we're telling lies about what happened and what it means. And so long as we're allowing people to tell lies and we're letting that lie fester, we can't get to reconciliation. I think we're really right now, I think, risking deepening those divisions by how we're still kind of couching January 6th in this sort of it was no big deal kind of moment. You hear some Congress people saying these were just visitors to the Capitol.
Yeah. They were just on a tour, claiming they weren't armed, denying that there was a scaffold to hang Mike Pence there, denying that they were trying to kill Nancy Pelosi. I mean, this whole idea of just making up things and looking you straight in the face and lying is something, my whole political career was based on my belief that you'd get credit for being truthful. And, in Wisconsin in those days, you did, but that's changed. And everybody has their own, separate internet means of getting information. And, I think some people actually sincerely believe this nonsense that Trump somehow won the election. And because it's beaten into them by the media outlets they listen to. And the whole nature of independent sources within, let's say, Wisconsin, newspapers, independently owned newspapers hardly exist anymore, that would say, hey, just so you know, we endorsed this guy for president, but he didn't win. You don't have that anymore because big companies have taken over and people don't feel that trust and connection to independent verifiers that they used to have. And I've seen that change in my adult career. It's a huge change and a very negative change.
We have another question from the chat. What are your thoughts on the Electoral College, getting back to the representation, and its impact on our democratic process? Would there be a feasible way to get rid of it, in your view?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was in high school at Janesville Craig High School, I was a debater. Big surprise, right? And I was sent up to Eau Claire, University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, for a month because they had one of the best debate schools in the country. And there was this little teacher there who was like the best debate coach in the country. Her name was Grace Walsh. And we had to do a paper for the summer in addition to debating. So I did mine on the Electoral College, like it was this funny, weird thing that would never be a problem. That was my conclusion. You don't need to change it because it'd never be a problem. So I like to call it an archaic, something that, even though archaic's not really a word, but I like to use it instead of archaicism. We did not believe that could ever be a problem until, of course, 2 Republican presidents became president, even though they didn't get the most votes. And it changed the course of history. This is how Trump became president. So my view used to be, well, he probably shouldn't change it, but that view is completely changed. You can have a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. And actually, back in the 1960s, former United States Senator Birch Bayh, Indiana, chairman of the Constitution Committee, almost got that done. It passed the House well by 2/3, didn't get through the Senate, so it didn't happen. Well, now everybody can see that it's just a travesty that this country doesn't go by popular vote. There's another way it might happen that I've been working on for a few years, and it's called the National Popular Vote Initiative. This is a compact of states. It's an agreement among states that's allowed under the Constitution, where every state would pass a law saying, we agree that all of our electoral votes will go to the person who won the national popular vote. And there's a number of states that have signed on to this thing and getting close to the point where there might be 270 electoral votes worth of these states. So it might come into effect. Now that will be challenged. It will go to the Supreme Court. Who knows what they would do with it? But that is a way, what's called a constitutional workaround. It is constitutional. It is legitimate, I think, but it is a way of doing it without having to get 3/4 of the states, which would not be easy because some of the states would, like we were talking about, ones that are small that have 3 electoral votes, they would not want to lose that particular clout they have. But it's possible, and I think there's a mounting view that this has to change.
Seems to me another place where this might change is if Texas does indeed go blue, which is, forecasters there try to always say that it's going to, and it will soon with demographic change. But, with voter suppression tactics also happening along the way, it's kind of hard to say at what point that tipping point could happen.
That's absolutely right, Professor. One of the worst mistakes people make is to believe that because a state is quote red or blue, that it's always been that way and it will always be that way. Nebraska is a great example. Nebraska was the heart of prairie populism. William Jennings Bryan, the late 19th century. Well, now it's incredibly right wing. But when I came to the Senate, they had 2 Democratic senators. So places can change and the political calculus changes. Yes. What about Texas? What if it becomes winner take all for the Democrats? A good historical example of this is when there was a fight about whether DC should be given statehood. Well, DC wasn't given statehood, but it did get the right to have 3 electoral votes. And at the time, there was a close call whether Republicans thought it was a better idea or Democrats. Why? Because African Americans have been Republicans since the Civil War, of course, because of the slavery issue. But because of Franklin Roosevelt and all the things the Democrats had done, that was shifted. And people weren't exactly sure which way the District of Columbia would go. Now, right now, it's overwhelmingly Democrat, but it's being gentrified. An awful lot of wealthy people are coming here. A lot of people are being displaced out into Prince George's County and out into Maryland. And so it's not clear. So you are very perceptive to make that point, is that any assumptions made about these places have to be considered in terms of the fact that these things can change. So I would hope people would agree that the person who gets the most votes should just be president and be done with it, but it's complicated.
Yeah. We have another question. What do we do about the fact that people on the right often cite the Constitution as their guiding text, even when actively working against democracy? For instance, I have a neighbor who has been flying a Trump flag that has a background text of "We the People." Is the Constitution then just a text that is open for interpretation by Americans?
Yeah, this is a game that's played brilliantly by the right. They take symbols of freedom, symbols of democracy, the flag, the Constitution, and they say, we're for this. But when you look at the actual language of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that says that everybody should be treated equally and that we should have a democratic system, that they don't care about because, really, in a lot of ways, this is just an excuse for authoritarianism. This is an excuse for a form of fascism, because you use the symbols of the state. This is what Mussolini did. This is what Hitler did. You use the symbols of the state, and then you distort the principles and actually turn it into an autocratic system. Mm-hmm. That's what they're doing, because this document has guarantees in it that, if taken seriously, could not possibly permit the insane claims that are being made about things like January 6th and some of the other techniques that are being used.
Yeah, I'm a gun scholar. I won't even broach that topic because that'll take up way too much time. But I think the Second Amendment is a perfect example of how it's used as a symbol, not as an actual text. And it's not put into conversation with the larger Constitution. Just one clause of it is removed. put on bumper stickers and not really talked about in its full depth. Another great comment here and question. As you noted, the Constitution represents Enlightenment thought and trust in the common use of reason. The Constitution likewise assumes good faith among parties. What are your thoughts on the problem of irrational actors and irrational forces active in the body politic and in legislative bodies, particularly the House and the Senate? James
That's
Madison.
a great question. It's really well phrased.
There's a little, let me finish it real quick.
Yeah, sorry.
James Madison argued that no system of government can long survive irrational mob forces. What remedies are available to this growing problem?
Yeah, this is exactly what the framers did get right. They knew that if they created a direct democracy completely based on majority vote, that you would have what Madison said in Federalist Paper number 10 is factions running the show. And that means political parties. They didn't think we should have political parties. And they structured the Senate in a way that they thought it would be a place where people would come together with some kind of consensus and govern in that way. But that all is based on reason. That is all based on this idea that you listen to different people's arguments and you sort of say, well, that's a good point. Maybe you got a point there. Well, this has all changed. Now you have politicians running on the idea that they're the craziest, nastiest, and most violent oriented person, and people seem to like that in a number of places. That used to be an immediate disqualifier, certainly in Wisconsin. If somebody acted like that, somebody would say, no, that's not the culture that we believe in. We believe in a culture of community. We believe in a culture of people taking care of each other. Well, now it's who are you against? Who don't you like? Who are you going to help us put down that has become dominant? And it is a huge cancer on our system. The fact that you had people like Josh Hawley down there whipping up these insurrections shows that his loyalty was to irrational hate and not to the Constitution and not to the Senate that he served in. And once you cross that Rubicon, you're in great trouble.
Do you have any thoughts for us about what we should be doing as average citizens from our positions, whatever they may be right now, to resist these forces that are at work to undermine our democracy?
Well, one of the things I always tell people, and this takes it to a little higher level, is when I first ran for the state Senate in 1982 in the area north of Madison, the rural areas there, I would knock on people's doors and I would say, hi, I'm Russ Feingold. I grew up in Janesville and I live in Middleton with my family, and I hope you'll consider me. And then if I started to say something about Democrats versus Republicans, they would say to me, well, we're not interested in that. We want to hear your ideas. And I found that for quite a while, especially when I was working with John McCain on the most famous bipartisan bill of the last 50 years, the McCain-Feingold bill, I found that people really appreciated that. They thought, okay, you got to have a party, and we understand it. But after the election, work together. This changed dramatically in 2010 and even in 1994, when the appeals to partisanship became much more intense. And so the divide is much greater now. How do we get back from this? It's hard. But I say to people, look, when somebody comes and says, I want you to vote for me, I want you to make them promise that they'll do some work with people on the other side of the aisle and say, when I see you in 2 years and you're running again for the House of Representatives, if you can't tell me what you did and whether you got anywhere on it, I'm not going to vote for you again. In other words, the truth is the members of Congress don't really want to be yelling at each other, saying hateful stuff, usually, most of them. But they don't want to get thrown out. They don't want to have somebody from the right run against them and throw them out, which has happened. So it has to come from the public. The public has to say, we want you to act like grown-ups. We want you to act like Americans first, and say, you're going to get kicked out if you don't do that, instead of who can say the most ridiculous thing about the vaccines. So to me, it's a political culture thing that public has to demand a better government and better people to do it. And that is ultimately up to the people themselves.
I think there's often a perception that there's no point in trying to communicate with your representatives because they're not going to listen to you. As a former representative and someone who's deeply engaged in politics, what's your view on that?
Well, I hope it's not true that it's hopeless, because that was my whole career. As people may know, when I was in the US Senate, I did something fairly unique. Of course, it gave me an excuse to go up north, but I went to every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties every year and held a town meeting. So I did like 1,200 town meetings, and they were open, and they were often in the town of Bell in Bayfield County or whatever, and we'd get these great crowds, and it was a more liberal crowd usually, but conservatives came. And there were on occasions where conservatives would say something, people would start booing them. I'd say, no, that's not why we're here. So what I believe is that you have to get out there and make sure that people feel that they can talk to you directly. And I'll tell you, I was very influenced by what I was told at those town meetings, things I had no knowledge of, or sort of measuring the intensity of what people thought. Great example is I led the fight against the war in Iraq. Majority of the people in the state said in the poll they wanted us to go into Iraq, but I held a town meeting in Horicon at the famous federal facility there with all the geese. And it was a town meeting, and it's kind of mixed about the war, but there was a guy in an army uniform in the back who did not speak because he was in uniform. But he came up to me in the parking lot. He said, "Senator, I appreciate your coming here." He said, "I'm prepared to die for my country, but this doesn't add up." And so it wasn't even the formal things, it was the informal input. And yes, the letters, the emails and stuff that came into the office, at least in those days, we really paid attention to that. You get 1,200 emails about something that really seemed to be authentic rather than generated by some big company. You pay attention. So I don't think people should give up on that, but it's got to be a frustrating time because people seem to make up their minds in advance instead of listening.
As a sociologist, I often think about culture and discourse and how I think so often we let powerful forces overdetermine the discourse. And we don't realize that there is a lot of concern and worry and anxiety among politicians about what their constituents think and what they're talking about. They read the headlines all the time to see what is the discourse, what's the mood. And I think to me, that's where we play a huge role. We have to contribute to the discourse. We have to be active and out there and have our voices be a part of it. Because if we don't, then we're just handing over all of the space to corporations and to the most extreme and the most savvy.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right about that. And of course, discourse is infinitely more complicated than it used to be. In the time when I was in office, newspapers, a few television stations, yes, Fox News was there. But now, how do you even determine what the discourse is? Because there's so many different silos. And, the internet is still relatively new. Hopefully it will progress in a way. But right now it's in a very bad place in terms of helping us have discourse. It seems to many cases be damaging. Access to information is terrific, but the discourse is not.
It seems to me there's a lot to be done at the local level there. Building community, building connections, building trust, trying to get away from this intense vitriol at the national level.
Local newspapers, local forums, things that are not necessarily gone forever. In Middleton, where I live in Wisconsin, it's a riot. There's a local newspaper, great, but there's like an alternative newspaper. And he's always sticking it to the other one. Mm-hmm. It's like the real thing. And they're arguing about what should be done with the Pheasant Branch Conservancy and whether to put a stop sign here, but it's an actual community journalism. The loss of that is an overwhelming loss, and hopefully it'll start coming back around the country. And, it won't just be, of course, print, it's electronic and others, but that can be done.
I don't see how we have a democracy without that. The public square, the notion of the public square, we still need that.
Absolutely. That's wonderful to hear you say.
We might have one quick one. Speaking of the influence of corporations in our discourse, do you see any way to undo some of the impact of Citizens United?
Well, it has to be overturned. It was a terrible decision. It was a lawless decision that had no real record supporting it. And although it did not overturn McCain-Feingold, it did something even worse. It overturned the 1907 law signed by Theodore Roosevelt to ban corporate domination of campaigns. So that can be overturned by constitutional amendment or possibly by changing the view of the Supreme Court, which is not going to happen anytime soon. Other things can be done in the meantime. States can experiment with public financing. The federal government can do public financing. That is not prohibited by that. And so that can help democratize campaigns, but the unlimited contributions are here to stay until there's either legal rulings or a constitutional amendment.
All right, we are just out of time. Hit it exactly. I don't know how that happened. So thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful and really just an honor to have you here and a fun conversation that's so important. So I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I truly look forward to doing this sometime directly on campus.
Wonderful. We'll invite you.
Thanks, Professor. Bye-bye.
Take care.